goal was to shoot it so that the head, the eye, the bill are all sharp, which this one is, and then I just wanted it to melt away after that. Once I kind of saw how they were flying in the areas they were flying through, I was able to change my position to take advantage of it. Yeah, well, that's pretty much how it works. So, as I was talking about technical difficulty, on cue, Scott comes up with a major faux pas. So, for those of you that didn't see that, I restarted the show again. The first time I started the introduction had no audio. So, welcome to the show tonight. We're recording this on March 29th, 2020. And tonight's theme is going to be wildlife composition. Wanted to follow up on a video that I did a couple weeks ago called The Basic Composition with the Rule of Thirds. And this one's going to go into a little bit deeper dive about composition. We're going to talk about in Photoshop what the crop tool actually looks like and what it means. And to do that, we're going to dive into something called the golden ratio and the golden spiral. That's just kind of neat stuff. Then we're also going to talk about some of the compositional theory around art in general. And I always give the caveat, I'm not an art teacher. I didn't go to school for years and years to study photography, but I really do a lot of research on my own. I'm just very intellectually curious about things, and that's kind of how I got into photography. And I really, really, really like to dig in and see how things work. The purpose of this, in a lot of ways, is just to tease you and hopefully develop some curiosity for yourself so that maybe you'll go out and explore some of these things. All right. So now that the audio's working and the stream's working and everything's good, let's go ahead and dive right in. So before we get into the topics, I'm going to bring something up, and it may not sound like it's related at first, but you'll see where this goes. And I'm bringing up basically just a great big triangle or a great big rectangle onto the screen. But this is a special rectangle that I've got up here, and this rectangle has very specific ratio. On the short side of this rectangle, you're going to see that it has a ratio of the short side to the long side of 1 to 1.618. And that ratio is called the golden ratio. And I'll explain to you what that means and how it actually works. And then we'll get into why I'm talking about this in the first place. So let's just take this rectangle. And again, the ratio is 1.1 to 1.618. That's the golden ratio. So why is that? Well, I'm going to drop this little gray box on top of the rectangle. And this created a perfect square. And a perfect square just means that one side is the same as the other. Every square means that. But how it pertains to this perfect rectangle or this golden rectangle is this. I took the short side with that had the ratio of 1 and made a square out of it. The remaining rectangle now on the right-hand side is white. And here's the magic. It also has a ratio of 1 now on the short side to 1.618 on the long side. It's the only rectangle that you can do this to. So it's only at these exact, and actually that 1.618 continues forever. It continues to infinity. So I'm just shortening it. Let's do it again. So now I've got the first square and the new rectangle formed in white. I drop it again. You see the dark gray is now a square, but look at this. I took the short side, made another square out of that. So the medium gray, and now the white represents that new rectangle with, again, the same ratio again. And this can repeat forever. So there it is again. Now I've got 3 squares in the golden rectangle, and do it one more time. And now I've got 4 squares in the golden rectangle. And this can go on and on and on for infinity. Now, why is this important? Well, it's important because it has a lot of practical applications. So let me show you where this kind of goes from here. If you Google golden ratio and just throw it out there, you're going to come up with a lot of things. So Google golden ratio in architecture, and you're going to come up with all of these different images. So once the classics started to realize this ratio existed, they started to apply it to a lot of different things. So architecture was one of them. This is the Parthenon. And if you look at it, this little guy did me the favor of putting all the squares up, but there's that golden rectangle, and it's actually structured around that pattern. If you Google golden ratio in art, it comes up in so many different things. You'll see some of these classics, some of these images you've seen before. The Last Supper's in here, Mona Lisa's in here. But it's really, really interesting. So once people started to see this, they started to recognize patterns and they started to apply it to classical art. And that's where our tie-in is going to come later when we get to the photography portion. And then take it into nature. And if you Google golden ratio in nature, a lot of different things are going to come up. But probably the most classic is this nautilus. And you could, and I'm going to pull this one up here, just double click this. Okay, here we go. So if you pull this up, you can see that golden rectangle here and the subdivisions that I just did. But I also want you to look at what it created when it did that. You'll see this arc. And I'm going to jump back into Photoshop because that's where we're going to start really the part of today that I find so interesting. When you take these golden rectangles and these perfect squares and you overlay the golden spiral, look what happens. So when you take that, it creates this curve, and this curve follows that pattern, the same one that we saw in the Nautilus. And there's not just the Nautilus. If you look at a lot of other things, you'll see that it's in sunflower seed patterns, and just it comes up over and over and over again. Super, super, super interesting. Okay. So I'm sorry, I want to make sure that I'm still streaming. So feel free to comment and let me know that this is still going out. So super, super, super interesting that you get these patterns, but here's why I wanted to tie it into Photoshop. So when you go into Photoshop and you look at the cropping tool, and hopefully you can see that. I know it's going to be a little bit small on the screen. You're going to see some options up here. So rule of thirds, we talked about that last week. But these other four, there's grid, which is just a standard grid. But these other four really do all play off of this golden ratio. So that's what I wanted to talk about a little bit. We're going to start with these little compositional guides to explain them. I'm going to show you a couple of quick examples. I also want to throw that out that I did a series of videos, and you guys know that I cross promote this channel, my free channel, with my Patreon subscription channel. I did a much deeper in-depth dive of these videos. And typically that's what I do. I like to do some free content for everybody. And then for people that want the deeper dive, head over and find me on Patreon, S-Keys Images, and you get some extra content over there. And I did a couple of these videos over there. So this will be a little bit more superficial. If you want the deeper dive, feel free to check it out over there. Now, how do these different compositional overlays work, and why are they there? So if you've ever explored these, and let me pull up one that shows diagonal. If you've ever explored these and feel like, why does that even exist? Look at how it lays off of this. So look at all these points of interest. So these intersections are called points of interest in composition. And it depends whichever compositional guideline you use. That's diagonal. And again, you could see that it perfectly crosses at a certain intersection here. If you do triangle, really, really cool. It intersects perfectly through this rectangle, and then also comes at a right angle out of this corner and intersects here, or I'm sorry, this is the right angle. And when you draw that right angle, it intersects through this corner and perfectly up to that corner. So just cool patterns start to evolve. And then the last one that's up here is called golden ratio, and it's actually exactly designed off the golden ratio. So you could see these compositional guides. There's my big square, there's my second square, there's my other square. They all fall into that golden ratio. So when you look at the golden ratio versus the rule of thirds, these are very similar. And a lot of people actually think that the rule of thirds is just kind of a bastardization of the golden ratio. But both rules are very, very similar. But the key point, and getting back to the video from last month, was you don't want to normally center compose, and you want to keep things on points of interest. So let me show you just a few quick examples of how this works in my composition. Here's an example of golden spiral, and you can see this coming right up around. This is an example from Blackneck Stilts. I actually shot this. I saw Ruth Hoyt on tonight, a little bit of a celebrity. She's a really talented guy down in Texas. I shot this down in Texas. And when you look at this one, I'm going to put this guide on, and this is diagonals. One of the interesting thing, I just have to make sure my aspect ratio is the same. So give me a second here. Here we go. One more time. All right, I think I did this at 3x2, so let me just get to the right one. There we go. So sometimes you compose intentionally, but often it just is kind of cool how it works out. So I will tell you, I don't always use these different compositional guides. I'm really just basically rule of thirds most of the time, but every now and then I'll pop in one of these guides just to see what happens to an image. Look at the cool thing about this image. I didn't alter this necessarily to compose to this, but after I had done it and I was doing this show, I thought, I wonder how that stilt image would look. And when I put it into the diagonal, notice this wing on the left is almost perfectly aligned with that. This leg is actually perfectly aligned with this. And this bill up here almost exactly hits a point of interest here. Now, again, you don't always plan it like this, but it is kind of cool when you go back and you look at things. And a lot of people will tell you that when they compose by eye, just by eye and using no compositional grids, and then they go back and look at it and overlay something, a lot of times it just works. Like things just seem to fall into points of interest when you put them there. On this Magnolia Warbler, I think we're going to use a different one. So I'm not going to use the diagonals for this, but I'm going to show you this one on triangle. Look at this one. Look how that branch falls almost perfectly on the diagonal. And then the eye comes right in and falls almost perfectly on that diagonal. Again, just really, really cool stuff. I'm going to say hi to a couple people because I saw my good friend Miguel Acosta jump on. So I want to make sure I say hi to you, Miguel. And then let's go to this last image. And this is a skimmer image. I want to make sure, again, I just have to change to the right aspect ratio. And I'm going to go back on this one. And I'm going to go back to that golden spiral. Now, and I'm using this as an example because this one I actually did compose with this in mind. Shortcut on Photoshop, when this isn't where you want it to be, hit Shift and O and it'll rotate it. So I'm going to rotate this to where I need it to be, and there it is. So when I was editing this image, I wasn't really sure what I wanted to do with the composition. I wanted the point of interest to be that wing hitting the water. It is actually almost exactly touching the water without breaking it, and there's almost no space in between the wingtip and the water. But we are so programmed as people to look at the eye that almost always your attention follows straight to the eye. So when I was doing this composition, I played around with it. And I said, you know, I wonder what it would work if I just laid it out onto a golden spiral and put that wingtip right where I wanted it. And I also then used some lighting, which we'll talk about later, to play it up. So I kind of brought the light down to the wingtip, and you'll see that I burned a little bit of the background in the bottom. So kind of a quick overview of the golden ratio. Again, the goal is for me not to do a semester class on this. It's just to throw it out there and tease it. And then hopefully people will go back and find and investigate and do some stuff on their own. But I did want to explain those compositional guides and why they're there and how they work and how you can also apply them to your images. So that's a little bit of the first part of this episode. Now, the second part's going to take a little bit longer. So I think this will go about another 30 minutes for the second part. But this is interesting. And if you need to take a break, if you're watching this on replay, it's a good time to just take a break and come back to it. Now, on this second image or this second portion, we're going to get into some compositional techniques. I'm going to put those up on the screen now. And I want to show you where I got these because I don't want to plagiarize. This is verbatim copy and pasted from a website. And let me show you where I got that information from. So there's a website called liveabout.com. When I was Googling information for this show, I had come across this actually a long time ago, and I took some notes on it. And I thought, well, let me see if this works for this show. And it really worked really, really well. It has these 8 elements of composition and art. You'll see them listed here, starting with unity, balance, movement, rhythm, focus, contrast, pattern, and proportion. It gives an explanation of all those. And again, it was just a really simple, easy to digest website. So just so it's a little bit easier to read, let me pop this up here and let you guys just look this over as I read through them. Now, they make sense when you read through it. I'm not going to read through this word for word. It's a good time to pause it if you want to read through it, if you're watching the replay. But I am going to show you how I apply some of these techniques to my photography and what they mean and how you can start thinking about your stuff. If you were to Google composition in photography, which clearly I did, you're going to come up with a lot more than these 8. So you're going to hear terms like negative space and scale and rule of odds and framing and contrast, all of these other things, leading lines. You're going to hear all of these other concepts in there. So what I did is I tried to take these 8 themes and break up things that I thought would make more sense to people as we went through the rest of the presentation. So that's what I'm going to do now. Let me go ahead and put this down. So if you want to, again, if you're watching this on replay, go ahead and pause. You can read through this. I'm going to push this down and just start going through the rest of the show. So the first element, and I'm not going to go through all 8 elements, but I am going to focus on 4 of them or 5 of them. And the first one is focus. So this concept of focus in art and in photography for wildlife, I wanted to make it really specific. You know, one of the things I really try to do is cater this show to wildlife. So take things, you know, that may have other, whether it's Photoshop or, you know, how to do things in the field. But when it comes to these educational topics, like how do you apply that concept to wildlife? And for me, specifically to the bird. So most of what we're going to see is birds, because that's, you guys know me, that's what I shoot. This first topic is focus. And the first one is really so simple. It's filling the frame. Filling the frame essentially gives you no option but to focus on it. With wildlife, sometimes we believe that focus is the only compositional element. And by that, I mean, people look at photography often as a photograph of a subject rather than a completion of a whole image. And composition in itself, if you look at the definition, it will almost always include something about the whole of an image or the whole of a presentation all coming together. So it really relates less to the subject and more to the completion or the total package. But when we deal with wildlife, a lot of times we are focused on that subject so much. So I'm going to spend a little bit more time on focus. And you can see with both of these images, basically just filling the frame gives you nothing to do but pay attention to the subject. But there's a lot of other ways to do that. So the other one I want to talk about with focus is depth of field. Using depth of field to create focus simply creates separation. In this case, there is a mountain behind this bird, but that mountain is a mile away. So what you see is simply the bird standing off on a clean canvas. In a minute, we're going to talk about negative space, but this is also a good illustration of what we would call negative space, which is just a lot of empty. There's just not a lot there. So depth of field. And then here, you can see that the background isn't a mile away and that it's not a completely empty void background. But the using depth of field here separates that one subject, which again is focus, from all of the other subjects in the background in flight. So while there are birds in focus on the bottom, they're stagnant and they're really not part of the image. They're static rather, not really part of the image. Those other dynamic birds that could be distracting if they were in focus really are so far out of focus here that your eye immediately gets drawn to the subject. So again, using depth of field. In this image, we're using 2 things. We're using depth of field, and we're also starting to introduce foreground. So in this case, you've got depth of field in 2 layers. You've got the depth of field in the front of the bird, in this case, a Canada warbler, one of my favorite warblers. I am jonesing for these warblers to come back soon. And then behind it, you could see that really distant. So again, that great separation. And even though there's some pattern and some color, it's not a completely sterile background. You get a really nice separation. And in this case, there's also foreground included. Here's an image that at first I thought was really odd. I wasn't sure that I liked it. The more and more I looked at this, the more and more I liked it. It does 2 things. One, it does add an element of foreground, which breaks up the entire image, but it also introduces another concept, which is part of focus, which is framing. So here, the wing and the tail of this accipiter, this is a sharp-shinned hawk in the foreground, actually serves to frame the merlin on the left side of the image. So while at first I didn't like this, and some people might look at this and say, it's not my thing, it's a little distracting, I keep coming back to this one. And every time I look at this, I like it a little bit more and a little bit more. All right, let's get on to the next one. And this is also an example of framing. Listen, you guys all have images of your own that probably show this. We're very fortunate with bird photography that there's a lot of opportunities to frame. Young emerging growth, this time of year, everybody's starting to see these blooms come up. It's an exciting time because it's when our perches are at their prime for this type of image. So you've got these small perches that you can frame in. You can frame in leaves overhead, to the sides, up and down. Branches can be used. Tree trunks can be used. There's a lot of elements that you can use in bird photography to frame, but you can do it with grasses if you're photographing mammals. You can do it with reptiles by having just elements on each side. But basically, you're just providing a structure in the frame for them to be in. And then the other concept around focus that can come up is called contrast. Contrast is simply putting, light against dark. And in this case, silhouettes by their nature are always high contrast. So these are two examples of silhouettes, but it's not always silhouettes. So here you've got some really strong light coming through the forest canopy. We would call this like dappled light. So it's coming through the forest. Everything else is in shade. I accentuated this in post by even burning this down a little bit more, but it really had this natural look right out of camera. This is kind of the look. You can actually see the shadow coming onto the top of the bird. Normally, I really don't like that, but in this case, I thought it was super, super interesting. And because the eye was right there against it, it created a strong contrast. All right, and then we're going to go to another one. This one, again, just shows strong contrast between light and dark areas, and it brings focus onto the subject. Again, that's the theme, focus. And then the last part of focus that I'm going to just talk about is negative space. You'll hear that term a lot. Negative space does not necessarily have to be white space. A lot of people kind of equate negative to meaning just an empty white canvas or an empty black canvas, and that's not the case. It really is anything that's not the subject, or with bird photography, that often includes the perch. So negative space is kind of the subject and the perch, and everything else that's behind it is negative space. Negative space just instantly draws your attention to what is left. And in this case, you've got this blue indigo, or this indigo bunting in that blue color really popping off against a nice green background. Again, it's not white or black. It's just kind of a solid-ish green. There's some color back there as well. All right, I'm going to take a short break here. Go ahead and ask some questions if you want. I'm solo, so I don't get breaks on this one. So I'm going to take a quick sip here. We've got a little bit more to go through. We've got 4 more concepts to go through. The other ones will move quicker, by the way. All right, I'm just looking to see if anybody has any comments. I don't want to move too quick. I don't see anything coming through. All right, so we'll get on to this next concept. I'm only going to, again, I only have a couple illustrations for each concept. At the end, I did like some of my top 5, just personal favorites around composition when I did this episode. The next concept is movement, and movement's a little interesting. And again, if I went back to this 8 elements of composition, unity, balance, you'll see movement is right here. Now, movement in photography or art, I'm just reading comments, doesn't necessarily mean motion in the subject. So think about those as 2 separate concepts. We're not really talking about movement of the subject. What we're really talking about is movement through the image. So how does your eye work through the image? One of the rules we talked about it last episode, was the rule of space, which generally means that the space should always be in front of the subject. So why, Scott, did you put this duck closer to the right side of the frame than the left side of the frame? So if we were rule of thirds, we're kind of on the wrong side of the rule of thirds here. But if I put this and laid it out, you would see that this little wake here is probably right around where that bottom third would be, and it guides you to the subject. So here, you can use things like a branch, in this case, a wake, and your eye is going to travel across that till it finds the subject. So it just helps break up the solid image. You can see all the negative space. We just talked about that. Look how much negative space is in this. And it keeps things real simple, but it lets you move through the scene. This is not my image. It's a beautiful image. This one is by Brandy Grawl. And she, when I went through and was asking some of my Patreon subscribers to send images in and take a look at composition, this one really struck me. And it struck me for a couple ways. I could have used this in a couple different concepts, but I thought when you talk about the concept of a leading line, which is what that wake was in the previous image, a leading line, I thought this branch really did a nice job showing that. First of all, curves are very, very appealing in photography in general. There's a thought when you, hopefully you Google some of this stuff on your own and you'll find some interesting stuff, but the difference between a curve and a diagonal is that the diagonals tend to create, they would call it like tension, or it's like a more, it brings out a more aggressive tone, and curves tend to soften. So this one worked really well because it's a nice soft curve that leads right up to the subject. But this also has two leading lines because this flower that's on the left side also creates a leading line. So you've got these two leading lines in this case that bring you right up to the subject. So a beautiful image, and one that I'm really, really excited to be able to include in the show today. Now, this one doesn't necessarily have like a leading line. I guess the top of the grass could be considered a leading line, but when you talk about moving your eye through an image, I like to show people how to use light as well. So here's an example. Again, a lot of negative space in this, high contrast. So I built the contrast. So I lightened this light area up here, darkened the dark area at the bottom, and made sure that this top area was kept dark. This actually was very dark because I was exposing here for this. This is a black-bellied duck, black-bellied whistling duck down in Texas. So that's what leading light is. Leading light, instead of using a strong line, it just takes the brighter areas and has your eye work through the image until it finds where you want it to end up. Now the next little segment, we're going to go out of focus. Let me jump back over here to my friend's elements of composition. And you're going to see that there's one for balance. And there's a lot of different ways to create balance in an image. So the first thing I wanted to talk about was symmetry and how symmetry can play into wildlife photography. Now, we have a rule, I said it earlier, that we don't want to compose centered. Now that is a very loose rule. I compose center often, but I almost always do it when there's symmetry in the image. So left and right are equal or similar. And in this case, I do it often with my head on. I have a whole collection of head on images. I love to try to get them as perfect as possible. This one I think is almost as close to perfectly head on as I've ever gotten a warbler, but I'm pretty lucky. I've got about 15 different warblers that are pretty close to dead on. So this is a black-throated green warbler that I think works as a center composed image. Here's a common merganser, a male with a nice little drip, but again, center composed because of the symmetry in the head. This is a green heron, center composed. And then I use this flight shot, this slow shutter goose, also center composed. But you could see all of those images had some kind of symmetry. So I did want to show it's a good time to break a rule once in a while. But when do you want to break it? It should have a reason for it. And with symmetry, you can often use that center composition. Now, here's another one. I wanted to include a couple examples of rules being broken. So with this one, this is a Canada warbler. This is on, this looks like mountain laurel. It's in the rhododendron family. It's very common in Pennsylvania. Rhododendron, very similar, has much bigger leaves. So I'm guessing this is mountain laurel. It could be a smaller rhododendron as well. But notice that the bird is looking to the short side. So when we talked about balance and symmetry, I'm going to move a little out of symmetry and talk about balance. And balance just means that you put something on one side to offset something on the other. In this case, because this patch of leaves I wanted to include in the photo, it justifies to me, when I was doing the composition, to move the bird to the side of the frame that I normally wouldn't. So generally I would put this bird on the left side and let it look into a lot of open space. In this example, I put it toward the right side and had it looking on the short side of the frame because I use these leaves on the left to balance it. So sometimes, you know, to me, it's like taking these leaves and drawing your line here and recomposing it that way. So these leaves almost become the border of the frame to me in that example. This is a really good example of both balance and symmetry. So center composed, but allowing these pine cones to really show. And this has symmetry in a lot of different ways, and it has balance in a lot of different ways. Not only did we have the two pine cones on the top, but we also mirrored them on the bottom. So you get like all four pine cones almost perfectly mirrored. So that's a really neat image to me. We are going to finish up with symmetry and balance. And I brought up a image of a northern harrier here that you can see. And clearly the balance just comes from this gull up on the right. The first time I showed this image, I literally called this a seagull. And I be small. You can also use things like scale. So when you provide, in this case, something familiar like a pine needle and put your subject in that environment, it really gives you a sense of how small this subject is. So in this case, here's your prairie warbler. Um, it gives you an idea of just how small that subject is. I wanted to show you two examples, and this one is a blackneck stilt. And the blackneck stilt is here to me, because of the angle I was in, there's no context. There is no scale for this. It appears to be a very large, tall, long-legged bird. Same bird in habitat, all of a sudden looks much smaller, at least to me. So it's a neat way to kind of visually play with the size of a subject. Same day I photographed both of these birds. And both birds look very different in terms of scale just because of the environment that they're in. So I thought that was just an interesting example. The last thing we're going to talk about is pattern. So this was one of those, let me go back to these 8 elements of composition. I didn't go through all 8 of these. I tried to pick the ones that I thought applied the most, but I did want to give you a couple examples of patterns and how you can use patterns. There is this thing called the rule of odds, and this is used in everything. Landscapers use it, interior decorators use it all the time. People that put pictures up on their walls probably have heard this. You should always hang them in 3s, not 2s. There's just a sense that 3 is more appealing, but odds in general, so 1, 3, 5 is more appealing. So rule of odds is pretty easy concept. I don't need a whole lot to illustrate that one. But there is also this thing about repetition. And I had Gray, I'll give him an Instagram shout out. He is Grayson Smith. I don't exactly remember his Instagram handle, but you can find him. I had him queued up for this, but his image wouldn't upload. So he's one of my subscribers. This is another one of my subscribers, Alicia Smith. I saw this the other day and I said, wow, let me see that and see if I can work it into my show, because I have this concept about repetition and pattern. And clearly it almost looks like this out of focus. I think this is a willet. This out of focus willet is almost exactly in the same position as the in focus willet. And then you've also got these lights that are repeating in the background. So I just thought it was a really interesting. Now, again, if we were talking about rule of odds, to me, the perfect image would have been having 3 of these layered, like the first, the second, the third. There is a third back there, but it's not really in focus enough or showing enough to show that repetition. But I thought it was a really interesting look at repetition. And then the last image that I'm going to close with, again, somebody that's a subscriber on Patreon. This is Shannon Pfeiffer, and a really talented photographer in the Pacific Northwest. And this is the concept of closure. So if you ever hear this term, it's more frequently referred to as leaving a little to the imagination. Your mind will do interesting things. Your mind will fill in the blanks. So you'll hear concepts of like leave a little mystery, or let people figure it out, or let their brain work, or let their eyes work. I think she did an unbelievable job with this image. A lot of negative space on the left side of this frame, but you can see that just making this, your brain wants to build the symmetry. It wants to fill in the other side of this. So while I think a beginning photographer might be really uncomfortable, or somebody who's less creative and bound by rules might be less likely to try these kind of compositions, they're very, very powerful. And again, I think this is one of the, in her portfolio, it's one of the strongest images I've seen. I know she has sold these because I followed her Instagram stories. And I just get really, really excited for people when I see stuff like this. And again, it's all of those images that I don't like to include any images in my show that I don't think are strong from other people. I really do think that there are some extremely talented people out there. I showed you some examples of other people's work in the presentation tonight. So, but this one I wanted to finish on because I thought it was just a real stunner, and very well edited. I love how it's just the light is just right. We also talked about things like leading lines and leading light. So in addition to that concept of closure, look at how just the line of the horn, and we talked about the curves, right? And how pleasant curves are to look at. It brings you right to the eye, and the light on the horn, the contrast. So there's a lot more going on here compositionally than just, well, let me take this sheep and slide it off the frame and try something different. So really, really like that one. I'm going to walk you through a couple of compositions that I really like, and they're not all my most popular image by any stretch. But but this one I really, really liked. When I posted this, I actually didn't edit this for a long time. I didn't have this in some like file sitting there like, oh, this is amazing. And then I see it in my Instagram feed once in a while, or when I'm putting together a show like this, I scroll through some old images and just look for stuff that work. And every time I see this, I just like it more and more. I think I've included it in another show before, but I just like the depth of field on this. It's got this foreground leaf here and the background there, and it's kind of framed in between this branch and these red areas up here. And I just really like it. So I put that in as one of my favorite compositions over the last year. Talked about curves. I like this simple minimalist approach to this yellow warbler. This one's on this thorny vine. I've shown this probably once or twice on my show before, but it's an image that I just really like, and I really keep coming back to it. I also like how these little flowers down here are kind of framed in this curve. So that's one that I just really like. I like this Blackburnian warbler. We talked about warblers. I wanted to put some spring warblers in here because I'm getting the fever. I do like this composition, and this is a little bit more classic, like a little bit more rule of thirds, but you can see that the framing here, using these young hemlock branches to frame the Blackburnian warbler. I wanted to include this one because sometimes composition is done in the field and sometimes it's done at the computer. I always encourage people, as much as you can compose it in camera, that's great, but it's really, really tough to do with static images. So, there's not a whole lot of opportunity to frame a warbler that's bouncing around. If you can find something that's static though, so owls are probably your best opportunity. Sometimes you'll get something perched, like waterfowl might be floating in one area for a while and you can move your composition around or reposition yourself. But this owl gave me an opportunity actually to work. Like I could have gone, wherever I wanted on this trail. Really lucky that the owl sits low enough that we were eye level with it. And what you see here on the right and left is actually two dark tree trunks. So I shot through these two trees. It was a pretty narrow opening, but I wanted to kill the branches and accentuate the middle and get the focus in the middle. So again, that's like kind of like that theory of contrast. The reason I'm showing you this is because this is one I was proud of from a compositional standpoint because it was done in the field with intent. This wasn't just, hey, I bet you if I take it home and burn down the edges of the image and do like this isn't really burned. It's kind of how it was. Now I did accentuate it, but it's kind of how it felt. So this one I really, really liked. And then I think I've got two more. This one, I showed you this earlier, and I showed you how that flow went. So how it, it kind of followed that spiral, and you could see this path has a natural curve and spiral to it. This, when I first edited this, I didn't think it was an unbelievable image, but it's one that I really liked, and especially the composition. The light's real pretty, the subject is nice, but it was really, this one to me was about the composition. I just love that soft curve in that leading line up to the deer. And then the last one here is a really good example of symmetry, and it's one that I am really, really proud of. This one took a little bit of work, but it doesn't get a whole lot more symmetrical than that. And I think that's what I'm going to close on. I don't think I have, nope, that's just some other programs. So anyway, let's recap real quick. Things that I think I would have taken away from this was just what the golden ratio is, and remember those compositional guidelines. Why are they there, and what do they mean, and maybe how you apply them. The other things I wanted to talk about is some of these rules around composition and some other things to think of besides rule of thirds. And it doesn't always have to be there, but I think primarily, how do we get our subjects? How do we get focus on them? So depth of field, foreground, framing, contrast, negative space. What are leading lines and leading light? How can you use them in composition? Symmetry and balance and how pleasant those things can be. And I think I showed you a bunch of different examples of that and how pleasing symmetry really can be when used correctly. Talked about minimalism, scale, And then I threw in a couple things about pattern with rule of odds, repetition, and then leaving a little bit to the imagination. So the goal was not to teach a lot. The goal was to hopefully get you out and get curious. So I hope I did that for you tonight. I'm going to take a quick break and look over here and see if there's any questions. If anybody has anything, go ahead and submit them now, and I'll go ahead and try to answer them for you. While we're waiting for questions, I will give you an idea of what's coming up in the future. Um, I'm planning a follow-up show to composition with Ray Hennessy. It will not be an educational one. For those that have watched the channel, I've broken it now into 3 areas. So I have educational, which this one falls under the general umbrella of education. I have my guest series, which I'm really, really loving that one. That's probably become my favorite thing to do, is just listening to other people get excited about their work. So I really, really like that series. So continue to do that. And then I've now added these short segments, these 10-minute segments, because honestly, short attention span, most people don't listen to hour-long YouTube videos. So I'm scaling back and doing some quick hitting ones. I just finished one called The 5 Most Important Characteristics of a Wildlife Photographer. I will go ahead and probably send that to my Patreon team and have them kind of give me some feedback on it. I've already gotten a little bit of feedback. Thank you, Edgar. And that'll be coming out in the next week or two. So that's kind of the general buckets that I do. And then I also have another guest lined up already, Colleen Gara. If you haven't watched her before or seen her work on Instagram or social media, really, really talented. I wanted to get some people that are non-avian wildlife photographers. So she's going to be in that series as well. And then I have some stuff coming up at the end of the year. So that's what's coming up short term. And yeah, I don't see a lot of questions. So, all right. Well, thank you for joining me. We had a really nice audience tonight. I really appreciate it. And thank you for bearing with me with the technical difficulties. Go watch, if you haven't finished The Tiger King, go finish watching that. Pretty interesting stuff going on. It looks like that one's trending. I'm seeing a lot of memes coming out with The Tiger King. Pretty entertaining stuff. And with that, I'm going to sign off and say good night. You guys have a great night, and I will see everybody soon.